That's fine, dude. I'm not mad. Those were the words Renee Nicole Macklin Good offered in conciliation to the government agent who would shoot her dead moments later in Minneapolis, Minnesota. ICE agent Jonathan Ross shot her in the face in an act of extraordinary cowardice that was documented on the scene and has been replayed millions of times since the murder. This was a graphic, grotesque example of state violence. Step 7 in the 10 steps to autocracy and authoritarianism, which I've laid out in the 10 steps campaign. You see, state violence is a key tool for authoritarians. Its purpose is clear. It's a stark, deadly reminder to not resist, not protest. Simply accept their demands or face the consequences. And at this stage of democracy's collapse, state violence becomes a regular feature of government. And so to normalize this horrific example of state violence, the Republican regime at various levels of government, not just the federal government, has quickly activated its preferred method of containment. 1, mislabel, 2, mislead, and 3, misdirect. You see, they begin by mislabeling, starting with who Renee Good actually is in order to strip her of her humanity. We're told to ignore her identities, that she's a mother, a wife, a poet, an activist, a U.S. citizen. Instead, we're told to recast her as a danger to America, a troublemaker, a domestic terrorist, a criminal. They do that because they want to cloak it in the specter of immigration as an evil, and therefore she was a part of the problem. Because they've already trained the broader public to discount the lives of migrants over the past year. You see, Renee Good is not a wife and a mother who was dropping off her child. She was part of the evil scourge of immigration and therefore had to be dealt with. And we're supposed to accept it because, well, we've allowed immigrants to be snatched off of the streets, to be caged in foreign prisons. We've accepted that they have been denied basic care right here on our shores. We have seen it happen and we've allowed it to continue, and therefore they think they'll get away with it because they have mislabeled who she is and who we are. After they mislabel, then they have to mislead. They have to justify Renee Good's execution by blaming the victim for her own death. And they tell us to ignore the evidence of our eyes. Media is twisting itself into pretzels to offer excuses or alternate theories. They have to mislead because otherwise we're going to demand action. And so they use this not only as a way to justify what they've done, they use it as an excuse to expand the assault, to convince us that her life was forfeited by her own actions. You see, we can't protest because the secret police will target us. And so we can't protest. We have to accept what is or face the deadly consequences. But they also want to mislead us because they want us to ignore the litany of death and injury that she now joins as at least the 5th known death since the administration launched its mass deportation campaign. In fact, that number might be as high as 32, but we don't know because they're misleading us to make sure we never, ever understand. And ultimately, the goal is to misdirect us from what is actually happening around us. Let's be clear. The United States government now operates a masked paramilitary that is armed and believes it has the absolute right to operate with presumed absolute immunity. And what's happening here is part of what happened with the kidnapping of Maduro in Venezuela, the killings of more than 100 people in the Caribbean, and the bombing of Nigeria, which we seem to have forgotten. Because all of these are proof that lethal force is a legitimate means of repression by this administration, by this regime, by these leaders in America's name. They want us to forget who we are. They want us to forget what we believe because the goal of authoritarians is not to have accountability. It is to have unfettered power. Renee Good died. We watched it happen. But the question is, what do we do in response? Our response must begin with the ICE protests that are occurring around the country. But Those protests cannot be the only actions we take, because ultimately, the Republican authoritarian regime is counting on us to get distracted, or worse, to believe we can do nothing at all. But the 10 steps to freedom and power that I have championed require that we do something, that we all do something, but we don't all have to do the same thing. And in this moment, we have to work in our own ways to disrupt their propaganda machine with the truth of our citizen power. We need to engage in consistent, persistent, repetitive actions, not because they're going to change everything, but because we must show that we're willing to do something. And at the local level, that means attending city council meetings and school board meetings and demanding that our elected leaders make public statements and make rules rebuking this behavior. It means that we have to publicly refuse to allow ICE on school grounds, and we have to prohibit law enforcement cooperation with their raids. Your mayor, your county executives, they can't independently stop ICE. No, they can't. But they can offer resolutions that can anger the higher ups and stand by them, because we have to create a record of opposition and a paper trail of morality. At the state level, legislatures are now returning to work. If your sessions are starting in your state, ask your state representative or senator to introduce legislation outlawing masked law enforcement in the state. I'm not saying it's going to pass, but we at least have to put the laws on the record. We have to put our demands on the record. But if you live in a state where it might pass, then demand that your state leaders create legal causes of action that give citizens the right to sue under state law. Look, the right loves the 10th Amendment. On the side of progress, on the side of democracy, let's try to use it for good for once. And yes, now is the time to call Congress, House and Senate, Democrat, Republican, Independent. No more performative pragmatism from our federal government where they pass a homeland security budget that funds this assault on our liberties. The government will shut down on January 30th without a new budget or continuing resolution. But we are facing armed, masked gunmen who are willing to kill us to keep power. So yes, it is worth shutting down the government to save American lives. To save American lives, though, we have to value them, regardless of documentation, skin color, gender, or status. Now, this Republican regime will tell us that we are traitors if we protest. But I promise you that now is the time of patriots. We are patriots because we know that our nation was born in civil disobedience. We are patriots because we know that we can do the right thing whether they want us to or not, that being able to nonviolently protest is the beginning, not the end, and that the demand of patriots is that our nation be what we deserve. If the death of Renee Good does anything, it has to be to remind us that this is our nation and we will not give it up. Joining me this week on Assembly Required is NYU law professor, strict scrutiny host, and all-around expert talker, Melissa Murray.
Thanks so much for having me, Stacey. It's great to be back.
It is always a joy to spend time with you. Unfortunately, though, we have more dark topics to talk about, and I want to start with Minnesota. We know that their state law enforcement says they haven't been able to access any of the evidence from the ICE shooting because the FBI has taken over. And this FBI, as a reminder, is led by Trump sycophant and former podcaster Kash Patel. Can you walk us through how an investigation like this should work, where a federal agent is the suspect, and talk a bit about what's actually happening?
Sure. First of all, we should just say that Dan Bongino, Kash Patel, giving all podcasters a bad name. We're not all like that. So I'll just put that out there straight away.
So you're not applying to become the FBI director in the next administration?
I'm not, but based on what I've seen, I think I could. and do a colorable job. But again, leaving that to the side, typically in circumstances like this, because of what we know as federalism, which is this idea that there are often zones of authority for the state and zones of authority for the federal government, but sometimes there are overlapping zones of authority. For example, in criminal law, you might have a situation where in circumstances where there is a federal officer who has done something, there would certainly be a federal investigation, but there would also be collaboration and cooperation from state and local authorities as well. And, that's even more pressing in circumstances that are denominated incidents of terrorism. And we know that Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Krispy Noem, has said that this is a situation that she regards as domestic terrorism. Like, I don't even want to unpack that, but be that as it may, if it is in fact an incident of domestic terrorism, post 9/11, the standard operating protocol for episodes of terrorism is to have collaboration between state, local, and federal investigatory resources, because that way you don't leave any stone unturned. Like, that was one of the failings of 9/11, the failure of state and local governments to collaborate with the federal investigative services, and they just missed things. And so going forward, we've decided that there has to be greater cooperation, greater collaboration. Also, Minnesota itself may have its own interests here. There may be Minnesota laws that were violated, and they may have the need to perform their own investigative functions in order to determine whether or not they have prosecutions that can be brought or other crimes that they want to investigate. I mean, there's so many reasons why you would want all of the resources brought to bear here, but apparently we just want federal resources, and they seem to know exactly what happened here.
Well, I want to pick up on something that you referenced, just because this is one of the few times where my writing and your knowledge come together in a really interesting way. So my very first legal thriller, While Justice Sleeps, one of my main characters is an FBI agent who heads up OLEC, which is what you just referenced, the Office of Law Enforcement Coordination, which was created post 9/11 to require that local and federal law enforcement, that they actually coordinated, that state law enforcement coordinated, because you miss information, you miss evidence. And the other piece that you referenced that you said you didn't want to unpack, but I'm going to push you on it a little bit, is domestic terrorism. Is that an actual legal posture in this country? Because we've heard it used several times in this administration, and yet, what does it actually mean?
It's a terrific question. I think I'm old enough to remember when we floated the idea of domestic terrorism with regard to things like the bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City or Waco or something like that. But now it seems domestic terrorism is just a catch-all phrase for individuals who don't agree with this administration and make their disagreements vocal in some way, or make their disagreements known. And again, I don't think it's helpful to just cast that term around lightly. I think it minimizes the true threat of terrorism in the United States, which I think is actually profound given the number of federal resources that this administration has let loose, because they don't believe that folks in the CIA or folks in the FBI are loyal enough. Like, we've seen so many experienced investigators just turned loose with all of their institutional knowledge just in the wind, because this administration would prefer loyalists to people who are actually experts at their jobs.
Assembly Required with Stacey Abrams is brought to you by Mosh. It's a new year and a good time to recommit myself to being more intentional about the way I take care of myself. That's why I'm a fan of Mosh bars. Mosh, which you may have heard about on Shark Tank, was founded by Maria Shriver and her son, Patrick Schwarzenegger, with a simple mission: to create a conversation about brain health through food, education, and research. Maria's father suffered from Alzheimer's, and since then, she and Patrick have dedicated themselves to finding ways to help other families dealing with this debilitating disease. Mosh joined forces with the world's top scientist and functional nutritionist to go beyond your average protein bar. Each Mosh bar is made with ingredients that support brain health, like ashwagandha, lion's mane, collagen, and omega-3s, plus a game-changing, brain-boosting ingredient you won't find in any other bar. Mosh is the first and only food brand boosted with Cognizin, a premium nootropic that supplies the brain with a patented form of cytocholline. Mosh bars also actually taste great and come in 9 delicious flavors, including 3 new plant-based flavors: chocolate chip cookie, hazelnut chocolate chip, and peanut chocolate chip. But here's the best part: to make you feel good, Mosh donates a portion of all proceeds from your order to fund gender-based brain health research through the Women's Alzheimer's Movement. Why gender-based? 2/3 of all Alzheimer's patients are women. Mosh is working closely to close the gap between women and men's health research. Mosh is convenient and satisfying, and it's easy to make sure I always have one handy, like the hazelnut chocolate chip bar. If you want to do good and fuel your body and your brain, Mosh bars are the perfect choice for you. Head to moshlife.com/assembly to save 20% off plus free shipping on the Bestsellers Trial Pack or the new Plant-Based Trial Pack. That's 20% off plus free shipping on either the Bestsellers Trial Pack or the Plant-Based Trial Pack at moshlife.com/assembly. And thank you, Mosh, for sponsoring this episode. Assembly Required with Stacey Abrams is brought to you by OneSkin. Short-term fads rarely deliver long-term results. That's why I like to use OneSkin. Their formulas are powered by the OS1 peptide, a patented peptide built on longevity science, proven to target aging at the cellular level. It's not about adding extra steps to your routine. It's about swapping in smarter ones. I like OS1i to refresh my skin after a long day, and the brand new peptide lip mask helps keep me hydrated, especially during these dry winter months. Known for cult favorite formulas like OS1 Body, OS1 Face, and OS1i, OneSkin stands out for their science-first approach to aging, validated in 5 separate clinical studies, delivering hydration, barrier strengthening, and visible improvements to the skin with every product. All of OneSkin's products are designed to layer effortlessly and even replace multiple steps in your routine, making long-term skin health simpler and smarter at any age. Born from over 10 years of longevity research, OneSkin's OS1 peptide is proven to target the cells that cause the visible signs of aging, helping you unlock your healthiest skin now and as you age. And for a limited time, OneSkin is making it even easier to stay consistent with up to 30% off of your first 3 subscription orders when you use code ASSEMBLY at oneskin.co/assembly. And for a limited time, OneSkin is making it even easier to stay consistent with up to 30% off of your first 3 subscription orders when you use code ASSEMBLY at oneskin.co/assembly. That's up to 30% off with code ASSEMBLY. After you purchase, they'll ask you where you heard about them. Please support our show and tell them we sent you. And then I want to dig into one other piece of this, which is the use of force conversation. The vice president over the weekend essentially said there should be absolute immunity, and we'll talk about that. But I want to lay the groundwork for understanding how use of force cases are typically investigated. And as you respond, I want you to talk a bit about the fact that ICE is not a traditional law enforcement agency. And if there are differences between their use of force standards versus, let's say, the ATF or the FBI.
So when Vice President Vance made that statement about this particular officer having absolute immunity, and he said it as though it were a fact of law, it's not. I mean, certainly there is immunity, often qualified immunity for law enforcement officials who have done something in the course of their duties. But again, qualified is not the same as absolute, which is what he is talking about, just sort of a broad license to do whatever you like. That's never existed. In this circumstance, He is talking about what's known as supremacy clause immunity, which is to say that federal officers, because federal law may be supreme in certain contexts, here immigration enforcement, they enjoy a kind of immunity from state level prosecution. So typically what happens if you have a federal officer being prosecuted by the state for something that has happened in the course of duty or outside of that duty, what you would have is a case brought in state court. It typically would then be removed by the defendant officer to federal court. And then in federal court, a federal judge would make a determination about whether it was immunized conduct. And that determination is very particular, very nuanced. Again, it's a very high bar. You basically ask whether the officer's conduct was reasonable in light of the officer's perspective, the officer's reasonable understanding of what was happening at the time. So, the court will decide from the perspective of the officer whether the actions taken were reasonable in light of everything. And that's a very sort of broad, sensitive discussion. It requires a lot of investigative resources because you have to figure out what was going on at the time. So, it's taking videotapes that were garnered by eyewitnesses, the dash cam evidence that an officer might have, the body cam evidence, all of that. And it really does, I think, require the cooperation not just of federal investigative resources, but also state and local to make sure you have as much information as possible in order to make that determination. If a judge determines that the course of conduct was reasonable in view of the defendant's understanding of things, and again, that's a very deferential standard for the officer himself, then it would be immunized. But the idea that there's some kind of blanket immunity and we are just allowing federal officers to go through this country doing whatever they like and they are entirely unaccountable, that just isn't true.
And that leads into one of the predicates for authoritarianism, this normalization of state violence. And one of the ways you normalize state violence is by asserting that state violence is not only permissible, it cannot be held accountable. And I think one thing that feels incredibly ominous right now is the way this administration, this regime, has very intentionally escalated state violence and normalized it. I mean, let's think about it. We've got the National Guard deployed in our cities. You've got ICE brutalizing people in the streets, in their cars, in their homes, in their places of work. 32 deaths in ICE custody in 2025, the deadliest year in 20 years, in 2 decades. And in more than one case now, ICE shooting and killing people. And so you just described what checks are supposed to be in place to curtail this type of state violence, but what level of accountability should we be demanding? And is there any recourse for victims, their families, regardless of their citizenship?
So it's a terrific question. And you just sort of laying it out just shows how fast and far we have fallen in just a year, which is not to say that it has ever been perfect. I think people of color in this country know that the prospect of state violence is always a hair's breadth away. But I think for many Americans, the idea that an ICE officer would shoot a white woman in the face at point blank range is, not only sobering, but really jarring. And I think we're all at that point right now. In circumstances like this, there are other methods of accountability. Again, your mileage may vary as to how desirable they are. I mean, there are always civil remedies that you might pursue. So, I always tell my students in criminal law this. O.J. Simpson was famously acquitted because the glove did not fit. But then Ron Goldman and Nicole Brown Simpson's family sued O.J. Simpson civilly for wrongful death, and they prevailed. And, whether or not they could actually recover the money that he owed them after that wrongful death judgment is a different story. But they got some measure of accountability. Is it the same as a guilty verdict? Is it the same as seeing someone who has done harm to your family member sit in a jail cell for some period of time? Probably not, but that is one method of accountability. Here, we could also have congressional accountability. If we had a Congress that could sort of come together on this, and I have to say, I think Some of the Democratic Party leaders in Congress and the way they have been sort of pussyfooting around this question is just deeply, deeply concerning. Yes, we all want enforcement of the laws. Do we want to live in a police state? Absolutely not. And the thing is, those aren't the two choices. Like, we can have something in the middle where we have law enforcement, but we don't necessarily have authoritarianism and people literally living in fear of the state. And, frankly, it's just been shocking and a little disgusting to watch people talk about what happened in Minnesota as a question of just, but we need law enforcement. Like, of course we need law enforcement, but we don't need people being shot point blank in the face. And, just side note, law enforcement, the whole operation of law enforcement is about dealing with people who are being non-compliant in some way. So, the idea that she deserved this, every officer who's called out to a situation is being called out to deal with someone who is not complying with the law in some fashion. They're not all supposed to wind up dead. That's the point. They've been trained to neutralize noncompliance, or they should be trained to neutralize noncompliance so that the threat can be mitigated, the individual can be contained, and the individual remains alive. That's what they do. So, this whole idea that she somehow deserved this or she wasn't complying, that's what happens in law enforcement situations. I don't know how to say that more plainly to everyone.
No, I think you're not only correct, but I think your analysis raises the question of the lowering of our own internal standards. There is this moment where this would have been so shocking to the conscience that our congressional members would have not only roundly rejected this, they would have been in the streets this weekend. And instead, we have the apologists who are saying, well, maybe there's a reason. And you have those who, again, what frustrates me is the sense of we just have to sound moderate. We have to have a moderated approach to this. And I do not understand, and perhaps you will either vigorously agree with me or you can give me an alternative. I don't understand the moderated approach to use of force against American citizens who are simply seeking to exercise civil disobedience.
We don't even know if she was trying to exercise civil disobedience or if she was just trying to turn around. That's the whole point of let's actually have a meaningful investigation, and an investigation at this point that is entirely handled within the scope of the federal system is not going to give the public the assurance that this was done legitimately. Just like it can't, given everything that these federal officials have said. So, I don't actually know what was happening. I know what I've seen. I might draw my own conclusions, but this is exactly why you have investigations, to suss out information you didn't know. Maybe there's a whole backstory for this officer. I don't know, but it doesn't seem like we're likely to get a fair rendering of what his state of mind was when this was happening, nor are we able to get a fair rendering of what she was doing. So, I think we know why so many people are being apologists for this. I think there is some sense, certainly within the Democratic Party, that they have to be firm on immigration enforcement. And I get it, I guess, but we're shooting moms in the streets. Like, is this what we're calling enforcement? It seems like at some point we've fallen down on the job.
So this weekend on social media, there was a compilation video that was floating around, and it had Trump and MAGA Republicans and others bemoaning the shooting of an unarmed white woman by law enforcement. And at the end, it's revealed not to be, the disposition of what happened to Renee Good. It was what happened to Ashley Babbitt. And I'd love for you to juxtapose the reaction that we're seeing and the defense that was offered of Ashley Babbitt's storming of the Capitol versus Renee Good sitting in her car.
I have no defense of Ashley Babbitt storming the Capitol on that day. I'm sorry that she was killed in that. And I think anyone whose lives were lost, the officers who later committed suicide, the officers who hurt, it was all an incredibly regrettable, preventable tragedy that unfolded 5 years ago on January 6th. I think, though, the difference in treatment of Ashley Babbitt and Renee Nicole Good by this administration reflects something really profound about what they're doing and the discourse with which they are doing it. And that is to say that ordinarily you would expect there to be at least some kind of sympathy for this mom. She's a mother of young children. She's in a Honda Pilot. She is a white woman, but she is so othered by her objections to this administration and its tactics. And we don't even know the nature of her objections. According to one video, she's telling the officer that she doesn't hate him and she's, whatever. But the fact that she's willing or seems willing in this moment, because we don't know exactly what has happened, seems willing to stand up to what is going on. And she's there to defend her neighbors who may be unfairly targeted by ICE, many of whom may be American citizens, because as we know from these Kavanaugh stops, no one is sitting around trying to figure out how to distill between individuals who are unlawfully here and those who are citizens but just happen to be people of color. But the fact that she objects, that is enough to turn her into a race traitor almost, to make her a traitor to this administration, to this project, to this understanding of nation building, and the way that they have painted her and literally dismantled her humanity, I think, is a consequence of that otherizing.
Assembly Required with Stacey Abrams is brought to you by Helix. I travel a lot for work, and coming home to the comforts of my own bed has gotten even better now that I have a Helix mattress. Buying a Helix mattress couldn't be easier. The Helix Sleep Quiz matches you with the perfect mattress based on your personal preference and sleep needs, so you can find the perfect fit. Not only that, Helix has free shipping in the U.S. and seamless delivery right to your doorstep. Helix is the most awarded mattress brand, tested and reviewed by experts like Forbes and Wired. And you can rest easy with seamless returns and exchanges. Helix has a 120-night sleep trial and a limited lifetime warranty. The Happy with Helix guarantee offers a risk-free, customer-first experience designed to ensure you're completely satisfied with your new mattress. Now that I've switched to Helix, I'm getting better night's sleep and having easier mornings. And I'm not the only one. A study Helix ran found that 82% of those involved saw an increase in their deep sleep cycle while sleeping on a Helix mattress. In fact, I liked it so much, I even got one for my guest room, though it may encourage them to stay longer, which I hadn't thought about until now, but still worth the risk. Go to helixsleep.com/assembly for 20% off site-wide. That's helixsleep.com/assembly for 20% off site-wide. That's helixsleep.com/assembly for 20% off site-wide. Make sure you enter our show name after checkout so they know we sent you. helixsleep.com/assembly. Assembly Required with Stacey Abrams is brought to you by BetterHelp. The new year is a good time to reflect on the support you need to lead a healthier, happier life. Therapy can help more easily identify what might be weighing you down by offering an unbiased perspective to better understand your relationships, motivations, and emotions. That's where BetterHelp comes in. The first step is finding a therapist who is the right fit. BetterHelp does the initial matching work for you so you can focus on your therapy goals. A short questionnaire helps identify your needs and preferences, and their 12+ years of experience and industry-leading match fulfillment rate means they typically get it right the first time. But if you aren't happy with your match, switch to a different therapist at any time from their tailored recommendations. BetterHelp therapists work according to a strict code of conduct and are fully licensed in the United States. With over 30,000 therapists, BetterHelp is one of the world's largest online therapy platforms, having served over 5 million people globally. And it works, with an average rating of 4.9 out of 5 for a live session based on over 1.7 million client reviews. BetterHelp makes it easy to get matched online with a qualified therapist. I've personally recommended BetterHelp to friends who didn't think they could afford support. Sign up and get 10% off at betterhelp.com/Abrams. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/Abrams. One of the conversations you lifted up earlier was the issue of what we're willing to investigate, what the federal government has decided is worthy of knowing. And last week, J.D. Vance, Vice President, announced that the Justice Department, which should be a neutral arbiter of truth, has created a new position to investigate fraud nationwide, ostensibly stemming from Minnesota, although I've not heard them talk about the fact that in Mississippi, the former governor, Brett Favre, and others are also accused of engaging in widespread fraud. And then you, of course, have our sitting senator from Florida who committed the largest fraud against Medicaid or Medicare in American history. But that notwithstanding—
Don't let that get in the way of a good time.
So what can you tell us about the way this issue of fraud is being politicized and leveraged, and, you know, because this is a theme, the hypocrisy embedded in how this administration is responding?
So get ready, America. Fraud's going to be the major way this administration, I think, prosecutes its disdain for everyone who is not them. So we saw a little bit of this in the presidential campaign. I mean, I think one of the ways that you see it, maybe not explicitly, but you can sort of connect up the dots, is that really powerful ad that turned out to be so effective for them. You know, Kamala is for they, them, right? The idea here was that there were scarce public resources, and Kamala Harris was willing to use them on this population of people, and we don't even know what their real gender identities are. Like, they could be defrauding all of us. Like they're basically gender frauds is sort of the underlying idea here. So that's one place where I think you've seen it, and I think they are playing it out in lots of ways. Like this idea that there is stuff and it's for Americans, but other people who are not Americans or just not part of this project are somehow bilking us of it. And I say us, but like, I'm sure I don't count as an American for this project, but bilking them of all of this stuff. So you see the way that it's being played out in the context of Minnesota, and it's being deployed against these Somali immigrants. So, you know, there's some evidence of fraud during the pandemic, although there was a lot of fraud during the pandemic and it was done by lots of different people. But the entire Somali community in Minnesota is being painted with this broad brush of criminality. Like, they're all fraudsters. They all have to be expelled. They all have to be punished. So that's one aspect of it. J.D. Vance did not mention this, though he could have. One of the things the Department of Justice is doing is using its civil fraud division to now address and investigate the use of DEI in private companies. And the idea here is that if you are a private company and you are in receipt of federal funds or you have a federal contract, you have an obligation under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act not to engage in racial discrimination. But if you have a DEI program, according to this administration, you are engaged in racial discrimination. And so rather than taking you on as a violation of Title VI, and I think because it would be hard to read Title VI in that way, they've decided to come at it from a different angle, which is to say that your receipt of federal frauds in light of your violation of Title VI is fraudulent. So we are going to see a bunch of companies, big companies, small companies, essentially either shutter their DEI programs or face these fraud charges. And it's all bunk. I mean, like, the idea that our consumer protection statutes would be used for this purpose, our government protection, like the protection of government resources, would be used for this purpose, the statutes intended to do that, it is absolutely bonkers. But there will be enough corporations, large and small, that just don't want this smoke and will close it all up rather than have to deal with the Justice Department about it. And that's the point. I mean, I think one thing we cannot say loud enough about what we have learned 1 year on from this administration is that they do win in the courts sometimes, and we can talk about that, but they often don't even get to the courts. Like, we saw this with the law firms and the universities. Sometimes they just issue these executive orders that have very tenuous legal grounding, and law firms, university just cave and give them what they want. And they call it settlements. That's not a settlement. Like, a settlement at least happens in the shadow of law. This is just happening in the shadow of what this president thinks. And it's just that people don't want to deal with it. Like, it is cumbersome to address. It may be costly to deal with it. Fighting it is not worth it. And so they just capitulate. And that is how he wins.
And that pre-compliance is so incredibly dangerous in this broader context, because I want to remind our listeners, DEI is absolutely grounded in issues of racial justice, but it also includes the Family Medical Leave Act, which was designed for women and for people who need to take care of family members. It includes the Americans with Disabilities Act. So the disabled have been disproportionately harmed by the attacks on DEI. That's why a number of veterans have lost access to resources and jobs. It applies to labor standards. When they say DEI, they do not simply mean racial issues. They mean all of it. They are adamantly opposed to diversity, meaning all people, equity, meaning fair access to opportunity, and inclusion, which means respect for belonging. And just in case we're confused, I'd love to talk to you about the New York Times article that came out where the president of the United States bemoans the civil rights era laws, which include not only the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, but the follow-on laws that expanded access to American citizenship and American democracy to millions of people who were not white men with money. Can you talk a little bit about why, and if you agree with me, I think DEI is under such aggressive attack because it is the central pillar of a pluralistic democracy. And if you're an authoritarian bent on white supremacy and Christian nationalism, there is nothing more terrifying than the body of law that includes all of DEI.
So first, let's just say a little bit about that New York Times article. And I want to just give a shout out to the New York Times reporter, Erica Green, who had to report this. Girl, yeah. I hope you got hazard pay for having to write this up. Like you did everyone a service, but I know that there was a psychic injury in having to report this. He's basically saying the quiet part out loud. The objections, the antipathy to DEI is the cornerstone of this administration. It is why this administration has been so vociferous in its objections to immigration, but welcome South African farmers into the United States under asylum programs, where they will not welcome people from other parts of the world, Black and brown parts of the world, who may also be facing threats. Also, we might question whether, in fact, the threats to South African farmers are as pronounced as the administration says in that special asylum program. Leaving that to the side, though, they have real issues with DEI. They assume that DEI is invariably correlated with the absence of merit. And I just find this argument smacks of white supremacy. I'm going to say exactly why. We've slowly, over the last 20 years, chipped away at the entire affirmative action project. And to be clear, affirmative action programs began in the federal government and the executive during the Kennedy administration. It was basically, hey, we have a bunch of federal contractors, and guess what? We've been discriminating against women and people of color for years. So we're basically going to say that, when you have 7 different federal contracts, you got to at least, have one person of color, one woman interview for them. Like, really modest measures to just simply open the door to people who historically had been included. Same for colleges. I mean, you and I went to Yale Law School. It wasn't like Yale was an HBCU. Like, it wasn't. I mean, right?
We know the names of every person with melanin.
We know everyone who was in our class and everyone who was in the class above us. Like, I mean, like, it just, the idea is absolutely ludicrous. But the way this is playing out right now and the way they talk about merit, it's like, we've so streamlined the use of diversity and like race considerations, gender considerations, and it's still not enough because what they really want is no one, because they genuinely believe that any person of color, any consideration of race somehow detracts from merit. Like, they just cannot even conceive that there is one Black person walking around who could be as good, who could compete. I mean, and that's not about merit. That's about white supremacy. That's about racial hierarchy. And so, like, if you don't get that, I don't know what to say to you. Also about racial hierarchy and white supremacy, and not really about merit, is the fact that for 200 years, you had these guys who basically had an artificially limited pool of competition. Like, they were only competing against other guys like themselves. Like, they didn't have to compete against any women. They didn't have to compete against any people of color. And they thought that was merit. Like, you weren't playing on the field with all of the available players. I mean, like, they tell on themselves constantly. I mean, it's not about merit. It's about hoarding resources. It is about racial hierarchy. And the sooner we all just like understand that that's what they're dealing with, the better. The other thing I think this is about is goes back to 2020 and the racial reckoning over George Floyd's murder. And I think this really explains why they have gone after higher education so forcefully. In the wake of George Floyd, I think they were deeply, deeply shook at the prospect of white millennials, white Gen Zers in arms with their Black and brown friends marching for justice. And I think it really shook them because I think for the most part, our lives are really segregated. Like, and the way you know this is go to a wedding, go to someone's wedding. Whenever I go to a wedding of a friend, like someone usually I've met in college or at work, I've noticed that their friends, their family groups, it's all pretty homogenous. Where the diversity comes in is when you start meeting the college friends, the grad school friends, the friends from work. We live homogenous lives until we go to college or grad school or go to work. And then that is when we come into contact with people who are not like us, who are not raised in the same circumstances as we were. And that is largely because of federal laws like the Civil Rights Act, like the laws that have required the integration of educational institutions and employment sectors. That's why we're able to do that. And it builds empathy. You get to meet people. You get to see a whole different side of things that maybe you didn't understand before, and now you do. And it might lead you to empathize with these other people, to understand things from their point of view. And when one of them or someone who looks like them is gunned down in the streets, you may be bestirred to go out and march with your friends of color. And that's what I think they are trying to prevent, that kind of empathy, that kind of bridge building, the idea that we would ever have cross-cultural, cross-racial understanding. And I think they're working at it right now. I mean, I think these schools are getting more and more homogenous. And, I don't even know what else to say about it. But y'all are going to have, I think, much less interesting lives because of it. You definitely won't learn the electric slide.
When we spoke last year,
your wedding is not going to be lit.
This may be the solution.
Assembly Required with Stacey Abrams is brought to you by Quince. Starting the year with a wardrobe refresh, Quince has you covered with luxe essentials that feel effortless and look polished. They're perfect for layering, mixing, and building a wardrobe that lasts. Their versatile styles make it easy to reach for them day after day. Quince has all the staples covered, from soft Mongolian cashmere sweaters that look like designer pieces without the markup, to 100% silk tops and skirts for easy dressing up, to perfectly cut denim for everyday wear. Their wardrobe essentials are crafted to last season after season. And their Italian wool coats are real standouts. They're beautifully tailored, soft to the touch, and built to carry you through years of wear, not just one season. The quality shows in every detail. The stitching, the fit, the fabrics. Every piece is thoughtfully designed to be your new wardrobe essential. And like everything else from Quince, each piece is made with premium fabrics in ethical, trusted factories, then priced far below what other luxury brands charge. With winter setting in, I'm focused on cozy staples like Quince's cashmere sweaters, which come in a variety of styles and in great colors. Refresh your wardrobe with Quince. Don't wait. Go to quince.com/Stacey for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada too. That's QUINCE.com/Stacey to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/Stacey.
So when we spoke last year around this time, we were beginning to grapple with the assaults on government, on civil liberties, on our own sense of reality. And we've now entered what feels like phase two. They've laid the groundwork for authoritarianism, and it's now time to really build the infrastructure. And part of that has been the aggressive assault on the Federal Reserve Bank. And would love to set up a clip and have you respond to that.
On Friday, the Department of Justice served the Federal Reserve with grand jury subpoenas, threatening a criminal indictment related to my testimony before the Senate Banking Committee last June. This unprecedented action should be seen in the broader context of the administration's threats and ongoing pressure. The threat of criminal charges is a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public, rather than following the preferences of the president.
So this is Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, talking about a grand jury indictment or a grand jury investigation that has not yet yielded an indictment. But this happens in the context of the Supreme Court case that will be coming up in a few weeks that seeks to remove Fed Governor Lisa Cook from her position. And it all speaks to trying to change the way the American economy operates. Jerome Powell and Lisa Cook may be the face, but this feels to me like an infrastructure play where they're trying to fundamentally change how America works. And would love to get your reaction to what we think is going to happen next and why this is so important to follow.
So I agree with you that I do think it is a play to fundamentally restructure the infrastructure of government, particularly within the executive branch. But I don't think that's all it is. So, the legal question here is about the president's constitutional authority to remove officers of multi-member agencies. And this has been an issue since Franklin Roosevelt. Congress creates these multi-member agencies like the Federal Trade Commission, the Federal Reserve, and they're meant to operate independently of politics. So they're not supposed to be buffeted by politics. So they're often bipartisan. The president may get to appoint some members, but not all members, and they all have staggered terms. So, you never have political control because they are commissions that are meant to operate with the underlay of expertise. That's really what's supposed to guide this, not politics. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had a commissioner of the Federal Trade Commission he didn't like so much. He wanted him out. And instead of just waiting for his term to elapse like a normal person might, he decided to just remove him without cause. You can often remove these people if you have cause, like they've done something wrong, like gross negligence of their duties, malfeasance, whatever. But that hadn't happened here. But he tried to remove him. The guy began a lawsuit against Franklin Roosevelt. He died in the middle of it, but his estate continued it. And in the end, Humphrey's Executor versus the United States was a unanimous decision of the Supreme Court in 1935 that said that Congress has the authority to insulate the members of multi-member commissions from being unceremoniously removed by the president without cause, right? And this has been the precedent for as long as I've remembered, and certainly since 1935, it's now on the chopping block as this president has sought to remove the members of a number of different agencies, the National Labor Relations Board, the Federal Trade Commission, Rebecca Slaughter, the Merit Systems Protection Board, and now Lisa Cook with the Federal Reserve. The Supreme Court has chipped away at Humphrey's Executor over the years, but it's always kind of retained this posture that somehow the Federal Reserve is different. Why is it different? They never say. I suspect it's because all of the justices are relatively wealthy and have investment accounts, and they don't want the Fed to tank. And you saw anything that goes on around the personnel of the Fed has the power to shake up the markets. When this investigation of Jerome Powell was announced, the markets dipped precipitously. So this is a big deal. Right now, there are two cases pending before the Supreme Court. One, Trump versus Slaughter, which is about the removal of a Federal Trade Commission commissioner, Rebecca Slaughter. And then there's also Trump versus Lisa Cook, which is supposed to be argued in a couple of, I think it's this week even. The fact that the administration is doing this to Jerome Powell as the court is preparing to hear oral argument in Lisa Cook's case is such clear evidence that they are in full DGAF mode. I mean, this is Sheree Whitfield from The Real Housewives of Atlanta. Who gon' check me, boo? Like, they don't care. They have like 0 Fs in the tank. They don't care. If you cared, you wouldn't be doing this right before the court takes up Lisa Cook's case. And all of it is at once about restructuring and consolidating power within the executive branch, but it's also about making this president look good. He ran on an affordability platform that he has done precious little to actualize in the years since he's been in office. His tariffs are a disaster that basically are just taxes that we're all paying. And what would help is if people could just buy homes like they used to without having large interest rates. And so he wants the Federal Reserve to lower the rates. The Fed, in their expert opinion, doesn't think this is a good idea. So he wants to get them out. He wants Lisa Cook out. And I think the antipathy for Lisa Cook is also because she is the first Black woman to ever serve as a governor of the Federal Reserve, because there are going to be vacancies. Like, he will have an opportunity to appoint another Fed governor. So I think he's kind of just like sticking it to her. But Powell's term as chair is up in May. He will be stepping down from that position. He'll still be on the Fed board, but he won't be the chair of it. There will be an opportunity to appoint other governors and maybe to capture the Fed entirely and lower interest rates. But they want to do it right now because they need to do it right now, because otherwise they cannot juke the numbers for the midterms and win.
I think that's accurate. And I think it's important for us to be able to hold both of those concepts at once.
Two things can be true at once.
Yeah. So that President Trump and his acolytes are doing their best to survive November midterm. But at the exact same time, there's also the sort of the machinations happening behind the scenes, the Stephen Millers, the Russell Votes, the Peter Thiels, the people who are trying to restructure America fundamentally. And one example for me is, President Trump did this interview with the New York Times last week where he spoke about his actions in Venezuela and his threats against Greenland, where he essentially renounced international law and he jettisoned the idea that even Congress or the judiciary could hold him accountable. And of course, the outrage poured forth on cue, and necessarily so. And the reason I'm pushing this is because my deep worry is that we are all so focused on him that we're not attending fully to what's being constructed around him. And I think about the fact that Hugo Chavez has been dead for a decade. Nicolas Maduro inherited his regime and put it on steroids. That the economic populist who comes to power is not the end of the story. And so as a lawyer who just really thinks deeply about these things, I'd love for you to speculate about what's happening around him and what should concern us in a post-Trump America. And, I want to frame it by saying, a lot of folks have entered 2026 as though the mission is to survive Trump in the midterms and then get back to normal in 2028. I don't think that's possible because of how they are reshaping the presidency and how the courts in particular are reshaping this into an imperial presidency, but would love to have you think about and talk about that a bit.
So I will just say at the top, we did an amazing episode of Strict Scrutiny. It was our first episode of this new year with Kim Lane Shepley of Princeton University. Yeah. She is an amazing scholar of authoritarianism, and she kind of laid it out, what's going on. And it's exactly as you say. I mean, I think you're right. Two things can be true. It can be about the short-term interest in lowering interest rates and making it look like there's affordability. Like in true wire fashion, it can be about juking the numbers. But it is also, as you say, a long-term play about completely restructuring this so that we will never have a real democracy again. That power will be so consolidated in the executive branch, in folks like Russell Vought, like Pete Hegseth, but mostly Russell Vought, that we will never be able to unwind this. And I think that is the real folly of the Democratic Party right now, to assume that this is merely a cult of personality, and that once you get past Donald Trump, there's no one like him. And, I think they are right that Donald Trump is a singular figure. I don't know that there is someone in his orbit right now who is as charismatic and as accessible to the populist cause in the way that he is. But I also think it won't matter if the apparatus of government has been completely rejiggered so that what we say or what other people say doesn't really matter. Like, if they consolidate their authority, they can literally put an AI bot who looks like Russell Vought in the presidency and just be boring but authoritarian till the end of time.
Great. You're giving them something else to build. Wonderful.
I think the one thing that may give us pause, maybe hope, is that there does seem to be a fair amount of internecine warfare within the inner circle about who is the heir. Who is the heir of Slytherin? Is it J.D. Vance? Is it Marco Rubio? I think it was really interesting that J.D. Vance was nowhere in the skiff that was not a skiff when they were bombing Venezuela. They may claw each other to the death to be the heir, but that might just leave room for someone like Russell Vought to sort of emerge unscathed as the heir of Slytherin.
And that's my worry, because one of the reasons I use Chavez versus Maduro is that Hugo Chavez was charismatic. He was compelling. He was beloved for a very long time. Maduro is fairly roundly reviled, but he still holds power. And my concern is that we spend so much time focused on the cinema of this moment that we're ignoring the construction and what that looks like. And so to that end, at the top of the show, I reminded our audience that the goal of this regime is to mislabel, mislead, and then misdirect, because ultimately their ambition is power, and that power cannot have accountability. And one thing that you and your colleagues on Strict Scrutiny do so extraordinarily well is explain to us what the law tells us should be, which is a reminder of what we said our country should be. So my question to you, Melissa Murray, what is it that you would ask patriots to do in this coming year to protect and save America from all that is coming our way?
All right. So I've always been something of an institutionalist. I think I'm becoming less institutionally minded as this progresses. They have captured the Supreme Court. I don't know what else to say about it but that. And, once captured, the court is in a position to do some real damage because they have so much power to interpret the Constitution. I don't think people just say things like, read the Constitution. I'm like, well, I've read it. It's not straightforward all the time. There's a lot of sort of broad brushstrokes and things that could be interpreted, a lot of ambiguity. And I think they're making the most of that right now. Even questions that we thought were settled, like whether Congress can insulate the members of multi-member commissions from presidential removal, those are up for grabs now. And, they are overruling precedent as fast as you can get it before them. So the Constitution itself, what the law is going to be what they say it is. And so that's cold comfort at this point. What does give me hope is that there are other systems, even within our own system. We've been talking about the federal government, but we also talked about, in the context of Minnesota, state and local politics. There's a lot of power in state and local politics, and we need to think about how to harness that power. When the GOP was out in the wilderness during the Bill Clinton years, they were building power at the state and local levels. They were taking over state legislatures. They were taking over school boards. They left no power on the table. They weren't in power in Congress. They may not have been in power in the presidency, but they were going to find the pockets and they were going to take them. And we've got to do that too. All politics is local. It matters who your school board is when you're trying to figure out if you are going to have curricula that includes people of color or LGBTQ people. You need to have people who care about those sorts of things and care about them the way you care about them. So those are the kinds of places where we can do things like thinking about the other systems of power that we can be a part of. And then, finally, the first words of the Constitution are "we the people." When everyone turned out for those No Kings marches, they were shook. They were genuinely shook. And when people turned out for elections in 2025 that weren't supposed to be anything, but were literally people being like, F this, I hate it, they were shook. And they should be, because this isn't popular. This is minority rule in every sense of the word. And, I'm just going to say this is going to be a hot take. After this is over, if it's ever over, we really have to think about whether this is the Constitution we need. It is a Constitution that has so many compromises on race, on slavery, on gender baked into it. It is a Constitution that enshrines minority rule. Is this what we want? And again, this is a really serious question. Like, I can see there are some places where we might want minority rule. Like the overwhelming populace might not be a great idea as a decision-making body. But right now, the fact that Wyoming has the same authority in the Senate as the people of California, that seems like an imbalance that ought to be structurally corrected in some way. The fact that we still use the Electoral College as opposed to the popular vote, when all of the reasons for the Electoral College have kind of dwindled at this point, that's a real problem. So I think there are structural impediments to a truly democratic system and society that we have to think seriously about how the Constitution abets that and how it might be fixed.
Melissa Murray, as always, thank you for being the hot take, smart take. Let's take it to the end guest that I need. Appreciate you.
Take it to the dance floor, Stacey.
There you
Do
go.
the wobble. All right. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. As always on Assembly Required, we know that our first job is to recognize what's happening, but then we have to take action. So for this week, here are your assignments. First, be curious. No matter your legal status, knowing your rights when you encounter ICE is more important than ever. So visit the National Immigrant Justice Center at immigrantjustice.org and learn more about how to prepare and protect yourself. For example, remember it is your right to film ICE. Visit the Electronic Frontier Foundation at EFF.org to learn best practices on how to lawfully film ICE activity. Number 2, let's solve some problems. Congress is considering several measures to curtail ICE, from ending qualified immunity to demanding that Kristi Noem testify, to leveraging the budget process to force changes to the agency. So call your member of Congress to find out what policies they plan on supporting to put checks on ICE, and demand they take a stand opposing ICE's xenophobic and violent actions. And make sure to contact your local officials, like your governor, your mayor, city councilor, school board members, and ask them how they plan to protect your community and your children. Visit commoncause.org/findyourrepresentative to find out who should be fighting for you. Third, do good. Immigration affects all of us, particularly when the system is broken. For example, even when bond is granted to those in immigration detention, it can be unaffordable. So donate to organizations like the Envision Freedom Fund at Envision, ENVISION, freedomfund.org, which helps free people from immigrant detention and advocates for policies against incarceration. Assembly Required continues to grow its audience, but we need your help. We reach more people when you tell others about us, when you add us to your feed, and share your favorite episode. So make sure you actually subscribe on all of your favorite platforms, not just one. Boost our visibility by rating the show and leaving a comment. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you go to get your podcast. And please check out my Substack, Assembly Notes, where we dive deep and where I share more of my thoughts on how we understand and then fight back against this authoritarian regime. Well, that wraps up this episode of Assembly Required with Stacey Abrams. Do good out there, and I'll meet you here next week.